Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Oughton and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Hey! I'm getting a little tired of this.
You volunteered, didn't you? We're paying you, aren't we?
Yeah, but I didn't know you were going to be giving me electric shocks.
Hey, how's it going, Chad?
I am doing great. I have some cool news from the world of Gozer. No,
Oh,
actually,
really?
actually, yes. So remember when we answered a question that a listener had about revival?
Yeah.
And the listener said at the end of his question that if we answered his question, he was going to send us a nice fruit basket.
Yes.
Well, which is, of course, is a quote from Ghostbusters when Pete Venkman says that about Walter Peck. I'm going to get him a nice fruit basket. Well, I actually received from an anonymous listener this week at my house a Harry and David fruit basket.
Awesome. That is amazing.
Yeah, and it's been great. We've been snacking on it the last couple days. This was no small fruit basket. We're talking not only did it have fruit, it had meat and cheese and crackers and cake and candy. It was amazing. So we're still snacking on it.
Stay puft
So thank
marshmallows.
you. Yeah, Stay Puft marshmallows. Yeah, and thank you to the listener. It was incredibly thoughtful. It was hilarious, and I'm just very grateful.
That's super. Well,
Yeah.
That's wonderful news from the world of Gozer. The world of podcasting today, we're going to be speaking with Sarah Enterline. Some of our diehard listeners may have remembered our interview with her back in the day when we spoke to her about the International Society of Women in Apologetics. But these days, Sarah is a writer, apologist, pastor's wife, mother, and teacher. She's taught apologetics, biblical studies, philosophy, and history at both the secondary and college levels. She also speaks at churches and conferences around the country. And she's working as an apologist with the Library of Historical Apologetics and as a writer and editor on the Special Divine Action Project. So, Chad, we've read her book, her recent book here, No Apologies, The Life and Work of Susanna Newcome. It's excellent. So we're going to be talking to her about that. What did you think about the book, Chad? And then we'll transition over to Sarah here soon.
Well, to be honest with you, when we receive the book, whenever you read a book for an interview, you kind of put it on your to-do list. You know, you're like, all right, I got to read this book. And a lot of apologetics books, just by the nature of what they cover, tend to cover a lot of the same content. But wow, man, I was really impressed with Susanna Newcome's argumentation. I was really impressed with how she went beyond just, a lot of apologetics today. And I'm not criticizing this, but it deals with what, C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. And Newcome's work goes beyond mere Christianity and talks about piety and how certain arguments should help us to understand what our relationship is before God and how we should behave accordingly. And so I was just really impressed with the depth and kind of robust argumentation in the book. She was definitely a thinker and philosopher that I'm glad I've been introduced to.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Let's get ready to go to that interview now.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, well, we're here with Sarah Enterline. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. It's just a pleasure.
Well, it's been a long time since our previous interview. I don't know what year that was. Do you have any idea?
It was 2011, maybe?
Yeah, we were talking about, International Society of the Women in Apologetics. But you've got a lot of new work that you're doing at the moment. Tell us a little bit about what sort of work you're doing right now, Sarah.
So right now I'm working for the Library of Historical Apologetics with Dr. Tim McGrew. And we started working together a few years ago, probably around 2015, 2016. And he was working on something called the Special Divine Action Project, which was a partnership with the Bodleian Library and just mapping and charting different apologetic arguments throughout the modern era. So basically answering deistic arguments and things like that. So Tim actually approached me at the time, asked me to do some full-time work for them, and thought I would be interested in basically researching all the women. And I was very surprised because I was like, what? There are women apologists before 20 years ago? And so, so he offered me that work and I started doing it. And I found just a treasure trove of these amazing women that no one's ever heard of. And so I've just basically been kind of focusing on that side of the project and just really researching all these women, but I'm also kind of cataloging and uploading the entire library to the website. So if you go to historicalapologetics.org, so far we have the A's and the B's, the rest of the alphabet soon to come. But all of those basically apologetic arguments kind of just during the Enlightenment period. So about from 1600 to about 1923. So we're cataloging and uploading all those to the website right now.
Super. Well, you mentioned one of the things that was shocking there is, hey, well, you didn't realize there was women apologists. Tell us a little bit about that, and what else have you learned that you didn't expect before when you started looking at these older apologetic works?
Besides the women, what I realized that I was kind of not saddened about, but I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan, and I realized he isn't as inventive or innovative as I thought he was. Because when I read all these old works, I'm like, oh, C.S. Lewis must have read this because this is exactly what he says, only it was written 300 years before him. So it's very interesting to find out how unoriginal C.S. Lewis is because he's so prolific and people just think of him as this, just groundbreaking person. And he is, he really translated it in a way that the average person can understand it, which is great. But a lot of his arguments come from these older apologetic works. And so it's interesting because I really wish that would encourage people to pick up these old works because all that wealth is there. And they're not reading past, like the secondary source. Like I would consider Lewis the secondary source in this category. And it's just sad because there's so much wealth that people are missing out on. So I think that was the most surprising thing to me was how unoriginal C.S. Lewis is. I still love him. He's still one of my favorites. But yeah, that actually surprised me quite a bit.
You've got all these older apologetics works. You're working, doing work for the Library of Historical Apologetics. And then you come across these different women apologist authors. So Susanna Newcome, why her? What appealed to you about her? And tell us a little bit about what really drew you in that regard.
Well, first of all, when I first read her book, it's written in old English, like Shakespearean English, because it's written in the 1700s. So when I first read it, I kind of thought, there seems to be something here, but I can't quite figure it out. Because, all the text is mashed together, like there's no, outlining or anything like that. And so it was really, really hard to understand at first. But I thought, it sounds like she's making a cosmological argument. This is interesting. So what I did is I actually went through her book page by page and I typed it out myself in modern language and just kind of trying to see exactly what she was trying to say. And once I was done with that and I fully understood the arguments that she was making, I was just floored. This is a woman in the 1700s. She was born in 1684, 85. And she's making these arguments that are people are kind of still coming up with today. Refining these cosmological arguments, that's a huge one in apologetics with William Lane Craig. And it's just crazy to me that she was so just ahead of her time. She's writing about Newton's laws of physics within 20 years of Newton publishing. Yeah. Just these kinds of things are just fascinated me. And I was like, who is this woman and how the heck is she so smart? And so I just went down this rabbit hole of research and I found there were a couple things about her online, but barely anything. Stuff about her husband would come up because he was a professor of divinity in Cambridge, but very little about her. So I actually kind of started emailing people in England and just emailing records, archives, and all these kinds of things. And just eventually kind of started compiling information about her. And then, Brian, as you know, we went out to England to do research on her. And then we stopped over and hung out with Brian and Judith and the kids in Ireland, which was great. But I actually went over there and I went to where she was born. I went to her father's church. I went to where she was married. I went to where she was buried. I went to where she lived, where her books are. And so I just did a ton of research. And the more that I found out, the more she fascinated me, because she's not only this brilliant, intelligent woman who was way ahead of her time with her arguments, but she also was this impeccable character, and just people just raved about her. And she just, it seemed like no one ever had a bad word to say about her. And so, yeah, so it was just, she was just fascinating to me. And I couldn't stop learning about her. And it seems to me, I'm still doing some research, but it seems to me that she's the first official published female apologist in history. So that's why I started with her, because I felt like she was probably the first. I have another one that's a possible contender from later in the 1600s, but I'm not sure. So I'm still working on that. But as of right now, she's the first in 1728. So she just fascinated me, and I had to know more about her.
Yeah. So you mentioned her husband. One of the things that stuck out to me early on in the book is she kind of had a bit of a unique relationship with her husband. I guess specifically here, what I'm talking about is she was actually held in much higher esteem than her husband as an intellectual. But he was kind of in the more, I guess the word would be authoritative or higher position, if you will. You know, can you talk a bit more about their relationship and kind of the uniqueness of it?
Yeah. So what I found out when I was researching is that they probably came into contact because her family was very involved with the college. And so, because a lot of her brothers and her nephew and people went there, I think it was her. I remember it was a couple of her brothers ended up going to St. John's. And so she probably knew him through them. They probably got introduced through that connection. And then they got married. And they got married when she was 40. So she was a little bit older. And the interesting thing is, he wasn't really known for, people didn't really like him very much.
Right. That's the sense I got from reading your book. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems as though he was he was a Whig in politics in England at that time. And he was kind of one of those people that would just kind of go with whatever the popular sentiment was at the time. And he wasn't looked upon as, that wasn't a favorable thing. He didn't really stand anywhere. He just kind of went after whoever had the power. And so that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. And there was an incident at the college where he made some statement that made people mad. And, and she just supported him through all of it. And it's just crazy to me because, like you said, everywhere where he is disparaged or something is mentioned about him, that he's just not the nicest guy or could be a better person or whatever, she's praised almost over and above board, just right. Her reputation's not damaged by his. And so it's crazy because she was more well known in the field than her husband, even though that was his actual field. He was a professor of divinity. So it's quite an interesting, I'd love to learn more about it. I don't think there is anymore, but if there was, I think it'd be a fascinating study of them.
Yeah, I just thought that was really, really neat. You mentioned her, not only she was, anybody that reads the book, which I really highly recommend that they do. Anybody that reads the book can it doesn't take long to figure out how brilliant she was. Right. But also she seemed to be, and you've alluded to that too, that she seemed to be kind of this picture of moral excellence.
Right.
Can you talk about how important that is for the apologist today to not only be well versed in argument, but also to be, a morally upstanding individual?
Yeah, so that for me was huge, because how disappointing is it when you find this amazing person and then you find out that they've got this secret life, or they're not as great of a person as you thought. And I grew up in the church, and I've had, pastors and people let me down. I had a pastor who was like a second father to me that had a moral failure. So I've gone through that over and over in my life. And so I've always really tried myself to have that character, to be, have that transparent testimony, and to just be open with everything, because it's so hard when, especially as a teacher, when I, for example, the recent Ravi Zacharias thing, obviously that broke my heart. As someone who followed him, and I met him once, and he was just very kind to me. And so it's just, that was very, very hard for me as an apologist. And it's hard because I feel like you can make all the greatest apologetic arguments in the world, but if your character doesn't back up your faith, then who cares what you're saying? And so, yeah, so that was, I mean, even that's kind of hard when I research some of these old historical figures. Some of them have some skeletons in their closet, and they produce these great works, but then you're like, oh, but he was, then. So it's kind of hard in the sense that, yeah, it takes away from your work. It takes away from the truth of what you're saying when your character doesn't back it up. And so I was super happy the fact that Susanna was not only this brilliant woman, but it seems as though everyone who met her could testify to the fact that she had this amazing moral character and that she was a super supportive wife and just kind to everybody. And there's another woman I'm studying right now, and kind of the same thing, just the story of her life. Just there was nothing but accolades written about her. And, they do preface, she knows she wasn't perfect, she wasn't perfect, but all in all, she was someone who strove to have her testimony, clean for the Lord. And so I think that that's incredibly important, especially with what we're dealing with today and the apologetics. Yeah. I think it's very important that people are above board, like I said, because all it does is just taint all the work that you've done. And, really, if we're speaking for Jesus, if we're trying to make a case for the Lord, even one of the arguments that Susanna makes is she's like, the Lord doesn't want to be like represented by people who would lie about him or people who would have like a deceptive type of lifestyle. So I think it just takes away from your work when you don't have that moral character to back it up.
Right, Sarah. So looking at your book here, I want the listener to understand what they're getting when they get this book. Now, it's amazingly well put together and graphically awesome. I have to say, my hat's off to yes. Matt in laying this thing out because it's beautiful. So that's awesome. But now you've got the portions that you've written, and then you've got the inquiry by Susanna Newcome. Mm-hmm. So that's her full apologetic work there. Now right. Tell about how this is laid out so that, hey, what am I buying? Am I buying her book? Am I buying Sarah's book? Who's talking here? Now I know, you've got your footnotes, which are really helpful all along, kind of interpreting some of the cryptic bits here and there, or maybe the special language of the time. But talk a little bit about how it's laid out, how it's formatted, and why you did it that way.
Okay, so at first, actually, when I first wrote it, it was just the first part was her biography of original research that I've put together, that I've collected. And so the first part of the book is just a biography of her life. And the second part of the book was what I originally had, which was just her work with my footnotes, just kind of explaining what she was saying. But as I read it, I realized I was kind of, while trying to hit all the audiences, the scholars, as well as the average layperson, I realized I was missing both because it was a little bit too difficult for the average person. I had people who had no background in apologetics read it and tell me what they thought. And then I had the scholars read it, and the scholars would be like, well, I don't like that you changed this word that she used to use into this modern language because I feel like it takes away from it. So I was missing both, trying to meet both. So what I did instead is I actually broke it up, and I put the second part of the book is just her arguments written out in modern language, easy to understand for the average layperson with my footnotes. And then the last part of the book is her original work, untouched, just typed up in the book. So it's her. So it's the first part is my biography of her life. The second part is her arguments laid out in modern English with my footnotes explaining them. And then the third part is her original unaltered work.
So one of the things that you said that as a dad of two daughters, a hearty amen it got from me, but in the introduction of your book, you specifically say that the fields of philosophy, theology, and apologetics are generally dominated by men. Yes. And a direct quote is it's time to change that culture. And I completely amen that. I can tell you that I became a Christian when I was 25. I'm 44 now. And when people were putting books in my hands and telling me about apologists, not one of them was a woman. I didn't know anything about people like Mary Jo Sharp or Nancy Pearcey or anybody like that. What practical steps can kind of the church take in order to make that shift that you're talking about, which I wholeheartedly say, yes, But how do we make that happen? Well, even on just the level of the church level, how can we begin to change that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. And actually, that's funny because that was what my first interview with Brian was about 10 years ago, was
Oh.
basically why I started the womeninapologetics.com, which is, well, it used to be the International Society of Women in Apologetics, and now it's womeninapologetics.com. But really, the reason I started that was because I was in seminary with Dr. Geisler. And I asked him, I said, I don't even know, what is the point of me doing this? Is there a point to this? Should I keep doing this? I'm like the only woman in this class, and he was like, let me tell you about these women that are doing it. And, they're doing it great. So I'll connect you to all of them. So he actually connected me to Mary Jo Sharp and Nancy Piercy and Gretchen Pasatino Coburn, who's passed now. And just all Judy Salisbury, Marilyn Joy Tyner, all of these women, he connected me with them, and they were actually apologists. They were doing it, but no one knew about them, and they didn't know about each other. And, and so when I started the website and I connected all these women, really the goal was to just bring awareness to the fact that there are women that do this. They enjoy it, and they're available to come to your church, And so really, that was the whole reason I started womeninapologetics.com, was to get that awareness there, so that when someone Googled the words women and apologetics, that would be what comes up. Because when I Googled it in 2009, the beginning of 2009, nothing came up, like literally nothing. So now when you Google it, hundreds of things come up, which is great.
Right.
But really, there had to be some type of catalyst to bring all these women together. And now it's this huge movement, which is amazing. And so the great thing is, I think that when you have women that are interested in that stuff in their church, now they can Google it. They can find other women. They can connect with Rachel and Jade, who now run womeninapologetics.com. They can connect with Hillary, who runs Mama Bear Apologetics. And they can ask them, hey, can you send a woman to our church? Or can we start a small group based around your book? And the great thing is that it's happening. All these women are going all over to, not now because of COVID, but before that, going to all these churches and talking to the women's ministries, and just basically, even not even just women's ministries, but youth conferences and just regular events, just church services. And they're getting the opportunity to show the world that women do this. And it is a thing. And even in my own church, just the pastor's wife was like, I'm just so interested in all these things. I'm just learning. She went down, a YouTube rabbit hole of apologetics, and was like, do you know this person? Do you know this person? Do you know this person? And I'm like, yeah, I know that person. But when you introduce that stuff, it really takes hold, and women do kind of glom onto it, and they really love it, mostly because, they can defend the faith to their kids, and then their kids don't have to be kind of sent off without any protection or defense against, what's going to come against their faith. But I think that was kind of the whole purpose of why I started that originally. And I think basically the biggest thing we can do is just awareness. Just tell people there are women that do this. Bring them to their church. Sell their books in your bookstore. It's not just a man thing, And the great thing is that, 20 years ago, there wasn't a thing, but now it is. And so, there are hundreds of women that do this. And so I might just think just telling people, yeah, women do this, and just bringing awareness to it.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like you're saying we're in a much better place than we were 20 years ago. So we're moving in the right direction to hopefully contribute to that shift. And the shift is happening, but at the same time, at the church level, that we can be more intentional about making people aware that this is not solely a man's game, if you will.
Right. I think seminaries too. I think one of the hardest things is that, if seminaries would be, willing to offer scholarships for women, or, for example, for me, when I started seminary, I was a single mom. So, it would have been great for me to have the scholarship or, some kind of support, and so the thing is that when women have a lot of, maybe, especially moms, maybe they might be interested, but they have a lot of other things going on in their life, or maybe they financially can't do it. Maybe just seminaries offering some sort of incentive program for women, or maybe just saying, hey, we're looking for women to join the program. Or, I don't know. I just think that women don't even think that they should do that. And so I think maybe just telling them, hey, the opportunity is out there if you want it. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So through reading your book and latching on to that and really feeling like, yes, that we've got to do that, that changes has to happen. One of the things I'd want to ask, and I want to tread lightly here because I want to be respectful, but there is kind of this attitude I've seen in the church, and maybe you've seen it too, where, men are built more toward kind of the rational approach to the faith. Now, please understand, I'm not saying this is what I think, because my wife, for example, is, she listens to apologetics. She loves the moral argument. I mean, so I know that's not the case, but there's this prevailing attitude of that I've seen is, men are kind of drawn by that rational argumentation, or women are more emotive, that they're more drawn by the feelings and the aesthetics and things like that. I guess kind of a two-part question. First of all, is that something you've heard as well? And then secondly, how would you respond to somebody who would kind of try to make that case?
Well, I've definitely heard it. I've had men tell me I shouldn't be in apologetics because I'm a woman and because I won't be able to handle.
Shame on them. Sorry.
But I've heard everything. I've been in it for over a decade now, so I've heard everything you could possibly imagine. And I grew up in a, I guess you would call it a complementarian church where, women are seen as gifted, but they can't be pastors. Right. And so, I've kind of grown up in that environment. So I've come across it quite a bit. My answer to that would be, you've never met me, because my husband and I kind of joke about the fact that I'm very much, and it could be because I grew up with a brother and a very strong father figure. I'm kind of a dude in the sense that I'm more logical and rational about things than emotive than, I sometimes can rub people the wrong way because I tend to speak just factually and not recognize that there's a person on the other side of the conversation. And so I think that I actually maybe fell into apologetics because those kind of looked like my people that I could fit in there.
Yes.
I wasn't that super peppy cheerleader, Proverbs 31, want to be a future pastor's wife at Bible college. I was debating the other guys in the theology class. So, and then I was looked at as, well, that's not the one you want to date because she likes to argue or she's too difficult or whatever. So, I've heard everything and I've dealt with everything, but I think the argument that I would make is that every woman and every man has a little bit of both, right? Like women.
Yes.
Are very rational in a lot of ways. I mean, look at the way they raise their kids. They can't be crying messes all day long if they're going to raise children. Like women are strong and rational and logical, and they have to make life or death decisions every single day. And they're under way more pressure than a lot of men. Just basically with how they have to protect their kids in the world that we live in today. And I think maybe that could have been true. The culture, 50 years ago, I'm not 50 years ago, that would have been the 70s. I mean, like 70 years ago, I'm dating myself now, like thinking it's still 2000. 70 years ago, maybe women were conditioned to be that way and they were conditioned to act weak in order to get a husband and to be very feminine and that kind of a thing. And maybe that's kind of a leftover feeling from a past culture. But the women that we have today, like they are strong. They recognize, the what is out there in the world, and they are trying to protect their kids. I mean, that's where you get the mama bear apologetics. Hillary's like, no, I'm going to protect these kids. And so I think that that's no longer the case. It might have been the case 70 years ago. That might have been the sentiment in the church, but you can look around today and that's not true. I mean, just look at the way culture's flipped. I mean, the way that men are acting today, I mean, you see very little true masculinity, and you see very, very little actual femininity. But then now the thing is, well, how do we actually define those? What do those actually look like? What are they supposed to look like biblically? And I think biblically, women are supposed to engage in the rational conversations. I mean, look at Priscilla. Priscilla is having this rational conversation about Jesus being the Messiah of the Old Testament, and she's teaching a young man, Apollos. So, so I think women are called to it. I don't think that it's necessarily that you have to be a rational type person to do it. I think the fact that you're passionate, and if your emotions, if you have a big heart, that's going to just prompt you to learn more because you want to help and protect those that might be led astray. So I don't, I don't think that that's the case anymore in the culture that we live in. I don't think anyone can really use that argument anymore.
Oh, that's really helpful. The one thing I'll say that really hit me there when what you were saying is I've seen exactly what you're talking about in the sense of what little sphere of influence I have with apologetics and churches I've been involved in things. Now that you said something that made me kind of go through my own experience, I have had a lot more women who are moms come to me and say, hey, I need to know how to teach this stuff to my kids.
Right.
So, I mean, that just supports what you're saying, that, this is something that, yeah. So that was really helpful. Thank you. I hope you didn't mind the question.
Oh, no. Loved it.
Well, looking at the work of Susanna Newcome is amazing because obviously she's a woman who's like light years ahead of so many.
Yeah.
And I'm curious from your perspective, Sarah, I'll say what I thought of some of her arguments, and then I'll ask you what you thought, because she's got cosmological arguments. She's got appeals to happiness, and sort of like fulfillment and design arguments. And wow, this is so comprehensive arguments from prophecy and all of this sort of it kind of reminds me of William Paley's stuff, where it's like so broad. It's like he's trying to make the entire case, every bit of evidence you can muster. And then the other thing that was shocking to me is like the terminology she uses for first causes and stuff. I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is William Lane Craig, pirating this information, because it's like everything that, began to exist, it needed a cause for its existence. Like, I was really shocked at the profundity of the arguments, the range and the depth of them. What were your impressions, and what do you think are some of maybe the unique things that she brings to the table that you don't see as much today, or whatever?
Yeah. So, one of my the first one that she kind of does is she starts from, the beginning. She starts with a cosmological argument, but her cosmological argument is more based on cause and effect, and appealing to the laws of physics, as opposed to maybe just the typical Kalam cosmological argument that you'd see today. So what I love is that she does talk about the fact that, look, if there's an effect, there has to be a cause. And then she goes in and she basically destroys the infinite regress argument, that if there's an effect, there has to be a cause. Like, you can't just, go back. Like, eventually, if you start at Z, you're going to get to A, and that's going to be the first cause. And I love that she goes through that, and just how she's so logical about it. And she just says it like, this is just the way the world works. So this is how it is. And I just love her brain and how she thinks. So definitely her cause and effect cosmological argument was huge for me. I just thought, wow, that makes so much sense. And then she started going into how machines are. And if you look at a machine and you say, oh, that's designed, then how could you look at the world that functions like a machine and say it wasn't designed? That just doesn't make sense. And so the fact that she appeals to common sense and the fact that we act differently depending on if there's a potential chance that God is the answer as opposed to not, when there's a moral component to the question, why do we act differently, when there's a chance that God could be the answer. And it's just that we're choosing to, right? We're choosing to say that if God's the end result, I don't want to go down that path. I'm just going to ignore it or say it's not logical, even if it may be. And even if you look at the same thing in another instance and you say that is logical. So I love that she just kind of calls it out and just says it how it is. And I just thought it was great that, she really got into irreducible complexity before, way before Michael Behe even talked about it. She's talking about it in the 1700s, which is amazing. And then, like you said, her prophecy arguments, just the fact that she lays out these concise syllogisms for prophecy. And especially one of my favorites is her argument for the afterlife using substance dualism, just talking about how if the mind and the brain are different, or the mind and the body are different physical, or if they're made up of different things, then they can't be the same. And so there has to be something else for the mind to be completed, like heaven. And so I love that she just naturally moves from one step to the other. I think of when I was in apologetics in seminary, Norman Geisler's 12 Steps of Apologetics, just very succinct, kind of laying out okay, well, we can't start in step 6. We have to start in step 1. And then eventually we'll naturally get to step 6. And so I love that she kind of laid her book out. She really starts with the cosmological, and then she goes into the teleological, and then she goes into the moral law, and then, the argument from desire. And so she kind of goes through each step And so I really appreciated that about her. But definitely her cosmological argument, the fact that it was the cause and effect aspect, I felt was really interesting. And then also how she appeals to Newton's laws of physics, I felt was the fact that she understood the law of inertia and the unmoved mover and all of those things at a time when, like, literally he had just written that book, like not even 20 years before she's writing. And her husband and her lived at the college where Newton was the professor of mathematics. So it could be that they met. It could be that they knew each other.
Wow.
I don't know. They were contemporaries. But if nothing else, she had to have access to his work because it's just the way that she talks about it. She just knew too much about it to not have access to it. So, yeah. So, and the fact that she's, self-taught, she's just reading all this on her own and just learning and just putting it together in her mind. And the Lord definitely gave her a gift to be able to kind of put all these arguments together and make them succinct to the point where it just makes sense the more that you read it. So, yeah, so that was, but my favorite one, I think, is probably, I love her argument from Desire. She talks about how if we're created to be happy and you're not happy in this life, if your desire is for God and he's the only satisfaction, but you don't get that satisfaction in this life, there has to be something after that in order for you to be satisfied fully. So I really enjoyed how she kind of fleshed that out because I feel like that's something that people are looking for. People are looking for that, that gap filler, they're just like all struggling. Well, I'm struggling with sadness, or I'm struggling with this, I'm struggling with that. And I just don't know what the answer is. But what they're really looking for is Jesus. And I love that she just gave that. And she's like, well, that's because that's what it is. And so I appreciate the fact that her arguments are not only prolific for the time and just incredibly profound, but they still work today. And, we're still talking about these things today, and we're still trying to all these arguments today, and what a value her voice would be, and what a value that her work is incorporating that into what we're already studying in apologetics. So,
yeah, one of the things I want to say too to listeners, if you're listening to Sarah and you're hearing words like dualism and cosmological and teleological, and you're thinking, what is this lady talking about? I can tell you one of the impressive things about Newcome's work is she goes into painstaking detail about these things. And she also defines her terms very well, regardless of what issue she's talking about. So if you're listening thinking, wow, this book sounds great, but it sounds like it would be a bit difficult for me, I would actually argue the opposite. I think this would be a great place to start if you're just getting into apologetics because of how the terms are defined and because of how much detail she goes into breaking these arguments down. And so I just wanted to add that in case, listeners would be intimidated by some of these words they may not have heard. This is a great place to kind of get educated about them.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the reasons I put so many footnotes. So
I wanted to mention that. I'm sorry. I wanted to mention that the footnotes are amazing. Even when you read something in Newcome's work and you're kind of thinking, I'm not sure what that means, you can literally look down and it's like commentary that goes along with the arguments. And so that's also helpful. But anyway, you tell them because you're actually the one that wrote them.
So for me, that was one of the things when I was reading her work, I was like, man, I wish I understood what she was trying to say here, because she is very, very smart. And so I think that coupled with the language of the day, she just talked above most people probably. And so I think for me, I was just jotting notes while I was reading her work. I had actually printed it out on paper, and I gave myself wide margins, and I just made notes as I was reading her work to try to fully understand what she was trying to say. And then those kind of became my footnotes. But my husband designed the book. So he's a graphic designer. So he designed my book, which it's beautiful. And I'm so grateful to him for that. But definitely one of the things that he would get frustrated with is the fact that there's over 500 footnotes. And I refused to have endnotes, which would have made his life so much easier. Because I felt that, if that note is not right there on the same page, people are going to get lost because it's just too much. She's just giving you too much in a very short amount of time. And so I really fought, and I said, and that was actually one of the reasons I self-published, is I wanted full control over the fact that I had footnotes on the same page as what she was actually talking about. And so sometimes even in the book, you'll see maybe large gaps of space at the bottom. And that's just simply because the thought continues on the next page and that footnote goes with it, and so I want to make sure everything's connected because I do want the average person to be able to read it and understand. So it is things like the teleological, cosmological, substance dualism, those big words. I actually do define those in the footnotes. So I may be using the big words, but in the book, I promise they're all defined and laid out for the average person if they want to read it. So, and that's mostly why I did that second section the way that I did, is I really tried to make it modern English, as well as have those very clear footnotes with, and then the great thing is that my website that goes along with the book actually has a list of the footnotes, all of them, and it's got the hyperlinks. So if it talks about an article in the footnote, you can actually click on the link and it'll go straight to that article. So the website is kind of a companion to the book. And then you can also see on the website, it's noapologiesbook.com. You can also see like her wedding certificate, the registry of it, her picture, her husband's picture, where she lived, the church where she got married, her birth registry. So all of the historical stuff is on the website as well. So if you want to learn more about her, it's all there too.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the I love you mentioned earlier kind of the boldness of her writing and how she's just out there. And one of the things she said, it was in Inquiry 4. Which is called Is Christianity from God? And she asked this question. She says, supposing God would reveal himself, what proof should we rationally expect him to give us of such a revelation? And she just comes right out and says, she just says that we ought to have evidence that is determined sufficient for the rational assent of all men. And she comes right out and says, basically, we should expect to see miracles. Right. And then she provides this robust argument for miracles. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was very bold of her, because especially right now on the internet, and I think this is partially due to the influence of atheists like Matt Dillahunty. You'll often hear people say things like, well, what's your demonstration? What's your demonstration? I almost feel like Susanna Newcome would say, well, what should we expect to see? We should expect to see miracles. And here's my case.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely, one of the things that I love about her is that a lot of times people don't rationally understand when they're asking for evidence, what kind of evidence they should be looking for. So there's certain things that are evidence of, let's say, historical works. We want to look for original documents. We want to look for primary sources, things like that. But when you're talking about, and let's say you're looking for an ancient civilization, okay, archaeology would be the evidence we would expect for that. But when you're talking about God interacting with human beings, well, the evidence of God, a supernatural being in the midst of natural beings, would be some type of supernatural occurrence. So that's what you're looking for, because that would be the footprint or the evidence left, the effect of a God intervening would be a miracle. And so I love that she just basically says, you can't expect evidence that wouldn't be the right evidence for that argument.
Yes.
And she basically says there are certain kinds of evidence for certain kind of arguments, and you can't expect the wrong type of evidence just because that's what you want. It just does. That's not how the world works. And so I love that. I love that she, basically says this is what you should expect. And then what my favorite thing about her argument for miracles is she's really one of the first to talk about it as a change in the laws of nature. Just talking about how that no one can change the laws of nature unless they created them, and basically goes into it says, no being can change his laws, he being the sole Lord of nature, without his consent. He cannot allow that they change to give evidence to falsehood, for that would be to act in opposition to his own character. Therefore, a change in these laws is full evidence that what is delivered came from him. And then she says, we call these change in the laws of nature a miracle. And I love that, because I'm like, people are like, oh, what if those things that happened weren't from God, or how do we know that that's from God? Well, God would not do something that gives evidence to falsehood or a lie, because that would be an opposition to his character, and he wouldn't be God, because it wouldn't be perfectly good. And so, so I love that she really, it just makes sense to me which when I read it. And maybe as a Christian apologist, it's easy for me to say that because I'm coming from a place of I believe this. But I think any logical, rational person reading this would kind of track with it and really be like, wow, she's making a lot of good points. And it even talks about how well her book was received in the time. And we're talking about a time period when like deists are just running rampant and just trying to say that God does not intervene in human life and he does not have anything to do with people and he just created and wound it up and let it go. And she's saying no. She's like, if that's the case, then Jesus isn't the Messiah and he is the Messiah, and here's why. And so I love that she ends with Jesus. I love that that's kind of the capstone of her argument, and she explains that if there are miracles, which we can see there are, because there are violations to the laws of nature, and so they must be miracles. And if Jesus gives evidence of those miracles, then he must be from God. So I love just her thought on that as well.
Yeah, I think throughout the book, you kind of see how good she is at anticipating potential objections and answering them, before they're offered. And I think in her miracle argument, that's especially evident.
Yeah. She says, if it said that, meaning like,
yes.
This is how I would answer you.
Yes.
So I love that she just anticipated what people are going to challenge her on. And then answer. And I love her humility too. Her humility at the beginning, she says, look, if I've offered anything that is contrary to the truth, let it be thrown out. And she's just like, all she wants to do is just tell people the truth. And I love that about her. So.
Yeah.
Sarah, one of the things about Susanna's work is that she actually made two versions. And I don't think we've talked about that yet, but the second version was a little bit of a revision, maybe like 4 years later. Can you talk a little bit about that and how she's, as I see it, she's kind of demonstrating that she's created an apologetic work, then she responds to something that happens in culture around her and updates that work to engage with it. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so her original 1728 version of her book was really, it actually had quite a large portion on happiness. So that was the main bulk of the argument. But then 1731 came around, and Matthew Tyndall wrote Christianity as Old as Creation, which was basically the idea that we don't need a God to tell us how to live morally, that we can figure it out for ourselves, and that basically nature is able to tell us how to live without us needing a God to tell us. So he was promoting deism. Basically, there probably is a God, but he doesn't tell us how to live. Right. So she read that and she got all fired up. And then she decided to, and actually many people responded to Tyndall. His book is actually one of the most popularly responded to books of that time period. Bishop Joseph Butler wrote a response to him, which is considered probably the best response. And he wrote it 4 years after Susanna wrote hers. But I mean, I can just imagine her sitting there having just finished her book, having it published, and then reading Matthew Tyndall's book, having that come across her desk or wherever, reading it and going, oh, I gotta answer this guy, just because that's just how she was. And so then she's just like furiously refixing her manuscript, and like within a year publishes the new edition with her answers to his claims. And basically her answer to him was that natural revelation is not enough, that we need more. Otherwise, God is not just, because a just God would not leave his children stumbling around in the dark, making mistakes, trying to figure out what the right way is. He would have sent somebody to tell us. He would have sent his word. He would have sent prophets to tell us how to live. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a good God. And that just makes sense to me. I'm like, if our highest happiness, if our highest satisfactions as humans is to please God, then he would not leave us stumbling around in the dark trying to figure out how to do that. He would tell us. And so therefore, we have to have things like the Bible. We have to have Jesus, not only for salvation, but also to show us how to live. So so she basically read his book and just furiously rewrote hers and expanded her section on natural revelation and just explained that it's not enough. We need the special revelation as well. And so that's when she starts giving the case for the special revelation, like the Bible and Jesus and all that. So
you alluded to her argument for Jesus's messiahship from fulfilled prophecy.
Yes.
And it seems to me, when I survey the landscape of apologetic arguments, the prophecy argument doesn't seem to be as favored nowadays. I think that's fair to say.
Yes.
Among apologists, But in her work, and you mentioned earlier, all the syllogisms that she has in arguing for fulfilled prophecy, and she even talks about how these fulfilled prophecies of Jesus, the implications it has for Jewish scriptures and Judaism as a whole. So I was wondering, after looking at her work on prophecy, do you think this is an argument that is kind of underutilized today? And do you think that Newcome's work would be a good place for budding apologists to kind of begin to study the argument for prophecy, from prophecy?
Yeah, no. So I think one of the reasons that we throw prophecy out as an argument for apologetics is because of, we have the higher critics. So the higher critics are telling us, and higher criticism was around at her time, but it really didn't become popular until the mid 1800s, which is much after her time. And actually, there's other women apologists works that I'm working on that have answered specifically the higher critics of the Bible, but really it wasn't a problem during her time period. So I don't think she was trying to answer that. I think she was just trying to show, here's why I believe Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Messiah. But I think the reason we throw it out is because we have the critics that tell us, Genesis it wasn't written when it wasn't written by Moses. You have the JEPD hypothesis. You have there's 3 different authors of Isaiah. You have all of these different higher critics who tell us that those prophecies weren't written when they said they were. So they're really not fulfilled prophecy, because if they're added in later, then, and that's why a lot of reason people throw like Josephus out, for example. Now, Josephus is rarely used because people are worried that it might have been too heavily edited. The parts about Jesus might have been added in by a Christian source.
Right.
And so I think for the same reasons we throw out the Bible, because we're like, well, if they're saying they don't even say that those prophecies were written 700 years before Christ, then what's the point in making the appeal to them if they won't even hold to that? And similar to us saying, well, you can't make an appeal to the Bible to someone who doesn't think the Bible is authoritative, right? So that's why we have to start with the other arguments. And I think really she was writing mostly to the Jewish people of her time period. I think she was writing to them and saying, look, if you don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, you have to throw out your entire scriptures, regardless if you believe that or not, because of the implications it has for what you believe. But I do think that the reading through, even just for me, it just blessed me reading through how much Jesus did fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament and how it could not have been anybody else.
Yes.
It just gave me confidence in Christ and in my own walk. And I think for young Christians, I think that's very important, because a lot of times, you can get the Richard Carriers or the other people who or Bart Ehrman that try to, cast doubt on the person of Jesus. And I think that it's really important for young Christians, young apologists, to have that foundation of not even questioning that he really is the Messiah. And then I think that coupled with that, they need to do the research of proving that the Bible was written when it says it was, and that those really are prophecies that were written thousands of years before Christ. That the Cyrus cylinder, that's a big one for me, the Cyrus cylinder, because I've seen it in person at, I can't remember if it was at the Louvre or the British Museum. And it's dated to the time of Cyrus, who wrote the prophecy about, the children of Israel. And just so stuff like that, like we need to do the work of proving the Bible to be accurate so that we can appeal to it through prophecy. And then, so I think, like Susanna, there's steps you have to take. So I do think it's important for young Christians just for their own confidence, but also they need to have the knowledge of the dating of the scriptures to back it up as well.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Like I was thinking of it more of, should that be an argument that we use more in sharing our faith? But I think that you make a really good point in saying that it's a great argument to bolster and encourage us in our own faith and who Jesus, was and is. And so, yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah, because the more that I read, I've been a Christian my whole life, and I've really never had any huge periods of doubt. But the more I read, because I have to read the opposing arguments all the time in order to understand what this person's answering. And so I do constantly read stuff that I'm like, oh, they have a good point. And then, I'm starting to question. So I think it's really important for apologists, because you are going to come up against those other arguments so often in your reading and your study, that you really need to have that foundation yes, Jesus is the Messiah. Yes, he is my Lord. Yes, he did rise from the dead. Yes, the disciples were not the type to lie. The biblical writers were trustworthy men who would not have lied. And I think just having those things are important for your own personal faith, especially as a scholar, because you're going to come up against a lot of stuff that's going to raise questions in your mind, when it comes to the deity of Christ.
Well, Sarah, we've kind of talked all about this book and so many facets. There's so many cool things in it and things that we've talked about. I want to just kind of wrap us up and ask you, when you're looking at the landscape of apologetics today, what do you think modern day apologists can learn from Mrs. Newcome's work? And in your opinion, are there any specific arguments that she offered that apologists should maybe consider resurrecting? If so, what were they?
I think the main thing that they can learn from her is how to logically lay out an argument. I think a lot of times that people, they tend to go all over the place and they don't really make a great step-by-step argument. And I think learning how to make a proper logical syllogism and learning how to appeal to the right kinds of evidence. And I really feel like she is a masterclass in how to present apologetic arguments. I really feel like that's something that people, even for me, she's benefited me now when I'm trying to write my own stuff on my own blog. Okay, how would I present this so that it makes more sense to the reader, that it's logically backed up? And so I think just the fact that she defines her terms, like she's like, no, I'm about to define my terms for you, so you can't question what they mean later. And just the fact that she goes through and she defines her terms first. Then when she uses them later, you know exactly what they mean, exactly what they're referring to. And then she appeals to the right kind of evidence for the right arguments. I just feel like she's just a great teacher as far as how to make an apologetic argument. I think she's great at that. And so I think that that's something that we could definitely learn from her. As far as I think we should resurrect her cause and effect cosmological argument, I think that that's something that is great. And I think that it's just the appeal to order and cause and effect, and just the fact that she, is like, you can't have an infinite regress, and that she incorporates the complexity of machines and the laws of physics into all that. I just think that she did a really great job in that argument. So I would say, just because of how popular the cosmological argument is right now with Christians and with atheists in the apologetic community, I feel like that's probably the one I would say I wish we could spend time on that. And I would love to get William Lane Craig's thoughts on my book. So if he hears this, or someone who knows him hears this, I would love to get your thoughts on just particularly her cosmological argument. But just because I think that she has a little bit of a twist to it, I think that that's new and interesting and would be really beneficial for us today.
Well, Sarah, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks so much for joining us. Point our listeners to where they can find your resources on the internet. I think there's noapologiesbook.com. Is there any place else you'd want to point them, or any resources that they should be aware of? So
you could go to noapologiesbook.com, which is just about Susanna specifically. And then there's also historicalapologetics.org, which is where we're posting all of the old historical apologetics works. The women are not going to be on there for right now because I'm working on projects with them, so they will come later. But and then I also have a website, sarahrenterline.com, which has all of news about anything that I'm writing, or my blog, or how to contact me, and all that kind of stuff is there. Super. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Otten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Streaming only on Peacock.
John Wayne Gacy killed 32.
Straight from the killer's mouth.
They want you to believe that I alone committed these murders.
The new gripping 6-part documentary series, John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise. All episodes streaming now, only on Peacock.
Frostbank won't charge fees on overdrafts $100 or less based on qualifying conditions. That means no fees on accidental overdrafts, emergency overdrafts, or even when you sign up for a free audio streaming trial to listen to more than the same 8 CDs you've had in your sedan since '03, but then you never use it because, hey, they're 8 great CDs, and completely forget to cancel the trial until it bills you for a full year. Overdrafts.
None of us is perfect, which is why Frost is introducing $100 overdraft grace if you meet qualifying conditions. Learn more at frostbank.com/overdraft.